Chapter 1. The Return. The rain was a fine mist clinging to the asphalt as the military bus pulled away from the curb. Marshal Wallace stood alone under the dim yellow streetlight, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his boots hitting the pavement with a steady rhythm. No fanfare, no cameras, no family waiting with banners that read "Welcome Home." That was fine by him. After 20 years of deployments and blood-soaked battlefields, Marshal preferred silence. He had imagined this moment for months. Walking through his front door unannounced, scooping his 4-year-old daughter Grace in his arms, and watching Candace's face light up in shock and joy. He smiled faintly, brushing a raindrop off his cheek. "Home," he murmured. The quiet suburban street looked just as he left it. Same trimmed hedges, same cracked driveway, same porch swing Candace insisted on buying though no one ever used it. His boots echoed as he walked up the path. The windows were dark. Maybe they were asleep. Perfect. The surprise would be sweeter. He slid his key into the lock. The door creaked. The smell hit him first, stale cigarette smoke, sour alcohol, something rotten under it. That wasn't right. Candace kept the place spotless, always spraying lemon-scented cleaner until the air stung. He dropped his duffel quietly by the entryway. "Candace," he called softly, a grin tugging at his mouth. "Grace? Daddy's home." No answer. Only the hum of the refrigerator. His senses sharpened. The soldier in him stirred. He moved silently down the hallway, scanning, listening. A faint sound reached his ears, shuffling, scraping, like something dragging across the floor. Then he heard it. A whimper. "Daddy." Marshal froze. His heart stopped. That was Grace. His daughter's voice, but frail, cracked, more like a ghost than a child. He turned the corner into the living room. Grace was crawling. His 4-year-old girl, wearing a ripped nightgown, was dragging herself across the carpet, her small knees scraping raw. She looked up at him, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Her little face was streaked with tears and grime. "Daddy," she whispered again, collapsing on her side. Marshal dropped to his knees, so fast it hurt. "Grace." "Baby girl, oh God." He scooped her into his arms, pulling her close. She was trembling, her body hot with fever, skin marred with bruises. That's when he saw her hand. 3 fingers. Gone. The stubs were bandaged with dirty cloth, soaked through with dried blood. Marshall's chest hollowed out. He couldn't breathe. "Jesus Christ. Who did this to you?" His voice cracked, a sound he'd never heard himself make before. Grace buried her face into his uniform. Her tiny shoulders shook. He held her tighter, rocking her instinctively. "Sure, Daddy's here now. Daddy's here. Nobody's gonna hurt you again. You're safe, Grace. You're safe with me." Her small hand fumbled at his collar, gripping the fabric like she feared he would vanish if she let go. Marshall's training screamed at him to assess. Shock, blood loss, infection. But the father in him could only see the horror carved into his baby girl's body. He kissed the top of her matted hair. "Where's Mommy, huh? Where's Mommy right now?" Grace whimpered, her lips quivering. "Tell me, sweetheart, did Mommy see what happened to your hand?" Her eyes, God, her eyes looked older than 4. Shattered. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. Marshall's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. "Who?" he asked softly, deadly calm now. "Who did this to my little girl?" Grace hesitated. She was shaking so hard he had to hold her steady. "Grace," he whispered, voice breaking. "It's Daddy. You could tell me anything. Nobody will ever hurt you again. I swear it on my life. But I need you to tell me." Her breath came in ragged gasps. Finally, she pressed her lips to his ear and whispered. "It was Mommy's friend, Brian." The name landed like a hammer in Marshall's chest. Brian McGowan. That useless, smirking bastard who lived 2 streets over, always hanging around Candace when Marshall deployed. Marshall had seen the looks before. But this, Grace clutched him tighter, desperate, afraid her words would summon the man back. "He cut them off," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "With the garden clippers. Mommy watched. She burned me with cigarettes too. She said you died screaming like a coward. In the war." And her voice broke completely, dissolving into sobs that shook her tiny body. Marshall's blood turned to ice. His vision blurred with rage and tears. His daughter's mutilated hand trembled against his chest. Candace. Brian. They told his baby girl he died a coward. They cut off her fingers. They burned her. They broke her. Marshall's arms tightened around Grace, his mind burning with one single, unshakable truth. Nobody hurts my daughter and lives. And in that moment, everything inside him changed. Chapter 2, The Oath. Marshall sat on the floor of the living room, his back pressed against the wall, his arms wrapped around Grace like a shield. She clung to him, her breath hitching against his chest, every sob cutting him deeper than any battlefield wound. His eyes kept drifting back to her mutilated hand. The dirty bandages, the infection threatening to spread, the trembling way she tried to hide it behind her small body as though ashamed. He wanted to rage, to break everything in this house, but he forced it down. A soldier never lets emotion rule him in the fight. But this wasn't a fight. This was his little girl. Grace, he whispered, brushing a strand of filthy hair from her forehead. Listen to me, baby. Look at Daddy. She lifted her eyes, swollen red from crying. Nobody, Marshall said, his voice steady now, the kind of voice that carried weight in war zones. Nobody hurts my daughter and lives to tell about it. Do you understand me? You're safe now. I swear to you, on my soul, you'll never be alone again. She clung tighter, burying her face in his chest. Marshall's phone was still in his duffel. He shifted Grace carefully into one arm, like he'd carried wounded men from the battlefield, and grabbed the bag. He found a phone and hit the one number he trusted more than any. The call rang twice. A gravelly voice answered. If this ain't a damn telemarketer, it better be important. Alex, Marshall said. There was a pause, then a bark of disbelief. Marshall? You son of a gun. You're supposed to be overseas. They said, I know what they said. Marshall cut him off. His tone was sharp, lethal. I'm back, and I need you. Something in his voice must have told the old Marine everything he needed to know. Where are you? My house. Grace is hurt. Bad. Real bad. A chair scraped on the other end. I'll be there in 2 minutes. Don't move. The line went dead. Marshall exhaled, rocking Grace gently. Help's coming, baby girl. Uncle Alex is on his way. Her small voice was muffled. I'm scared, Daddy. I know. He kissed her head. But you don't have to be scared anymore. Daddy's got you. Daddy's not going anywhere. Moments later, the front door burst open without a knock. A hulking figure filled the frame. Alex Sims, 63 years old, retired Marine gunnery sergeant, and every bit as dangerous as he'd been in uniform. His salt and pepper beard bristled. His eyes narrowed as they landed on Grace in Marshall's arms. Christ almighty, Alex muttered. He crossed the room in 3 strides, crouching beside them. What the hell happened to her? Candace's boyfriend, Marshall said, his tone like steel. Brian McGowan cut off her fingers, burned her, and Candace stood there and let it happen. Alex's jaw flexed, his fists balling. I'll kill the son of... Not yet, Marshall snapped, his ranger discipline locking down his fury. Killing him outright is too easy. He'll pay. They both will. But first I need to know Grace is safe. Alex's gaze softened as he reached out, gently touching Grace's uninjured hand. Hey, sweetheart. It's Uncle Alex. You remember me? Grace sniffled, nodding weakly. You're safe now, Alex said, his voice surprisingly tender for a man who once broke ribs in bar fights for fun. Me and your daddy, we're not letting anything happen to you again. Marshall met Alex's eyes, an unspoken pact forming between them. Can you stay with her? Marshall asked. Alex's brows shot up. Stay with her? Hell, I'll chain myself to this floor if that's what it takes. Where are you going? Marshall rose slowly, setting Grace on the couch and wrapping her in a blanket. He crouched so she could see his eyes. I have to step out for a little while, baby girl. Uncle Alex will be right here with you, and I'll be back before you know it. But Daddy's got something to take care of. Her lips trembled. Don't leave me, Daddy. The words hit harder than a bullet. He brushed her cheek with his thumb. Listen to me, Grace. I am not leaving you. I'm never leaving you. But if I don't do this, the bad people will think they can come back. And I can't let that happen. I need you to be brave for me, just for a little while. She stared at him, then nodded weakly. Marshall kissed her forehead, then stood and turned to Alex. Lock every door, every window. Anyone but me comes through that door, you put them down. You hear me?" Alex's lips curled into a grim smile. "You don't gotta tell me twice. I've been itching for some action anyway." Marshall grabbed his duffel and pulled out his sidearm, checking the chamber with the fluid motion of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. He holstered it at his hip, the weight familiar, reassuring. Alex's eyes followed the weapon. "You planning on storming his place tonight?" Marshall shook his head. "Not yet. First, I gather intel. I don't go into a fight blind. I'll use everything I know. Every contact. Every trick the Army ever taught me. When I move on them, it won't be rage. It'll be precision. And they'll never see it coming." Alex grunted in approval. "That's the Ranger in you talking." "No," Marshall corrected, his gaze sliding back to Grace on the couch, her fragile body curled under the blanket. "That's the father in me talking. They hurt my little girl. They thought I was gone. They thought they could erase me. But they don't understand. This war is only beginning." He moved to the doorway, his body vibrating with restrained fury. His heart was steady, but his blood ran cold with purpose. Behind him, Alex called out, "Marshall!" He stopped, hand on the frame. "Don't let your anger blind you," Alex said firmly. "Plan it. Make it clean. You're not in the desert anymore. This is home turf. You do it right, they'll never crawl out of the hole you put him in." Marshall gave a grim nod. "Oh, I'll make it clean. Military clean. Legal clean. When I'm done, Brian and Candace won't just lose their freedom. They'll lose everything. Their names, their reputations, their futures." He looked back one last time at Grace, her tiny hand clutching the blanket, her eyes closing in exhaustion. And in that moment, Marshall swore it like an oath carved into stone. "Nobody hurts my daughter and lives. Nobody." With that vow burning in his chest, he stepped out into the night, ready to unleash hell with the patience of a soldier and the fury of a father. Chapter 3, The Party of Betrayal. The night air was cool, carrying the faint thump of bass from 2 streets over. Marshall's truck idled at the curb, its engine off, headlights dark. He sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel like he was back in a Humvee waiting for the order to breach. The house ahead of him glowed like a beacon, laughter spilling out from open windows. He knew that house well, Brian McGowan's, a 2-story colonial with a wide porch and a yard he bragged about every summer. Tonight, it wasn't just a house. It was a nest of betrayal. Marshall adjusted the small recording device clipped inside his jacket pocket. Every word spoken tonight would be captured. He wasn't just here to confront them. He was here to build a case, brick by brick, until their world collapsed under its own rot. He stepped out of the truck, boots silent on the pavement, and strode toward the house. With each step, he replayed Grace's broken voice in his mind. "Mommy's friend Brian. He cut them off. She burned me. She said you died a coward." The fury sharpened his focus. Music and voices swelled as he reached the porch. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and walked inside. The living room was alive with people, half-drunk coworkers, neighbors, friends. A banner hung on the wall. "Life goes on," with balloons and streamers dangling beneath it. Candace stood near the center, a wineglass in hand, her laughter bright and false. Beside her, Brian leaned back in a chair, his arms slung casually around her waist, smirking at some crude joke. Marshall's presence hit the room like a grenade. The laughter died. Heads turned. Glasses froze midair. Candace's wineglass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Her face went pale. "Marshall," she breathed. Brian blinked, confused, then forced a laugh. "No way. Is some kind of stunt? He's supposed to be dead?" Marshall's voice cut through the room, cold and sharp. "That's what you told my daughter, isn't it? That I died screaming like a coward." Silence. Only the music thumped faintly in the background until someone scrambled to turn it off. Marshall stepped further into the room, eyes fixed on Candace. "Tell me, Candace, did it make you feel better? Watching him hurt our little girl? Did it make you feel powerful?" Candace's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but every guest was frozen, watching. Brian stood, puffing his chest. "Careful how you talk to her, Wallace. You've been gone a long time." She needed somebody to finish that sentence, Marshall growled, his body squaring up. Go on. Tell this room what she needed. A man to torture her daughter while she watched. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Candace's face flushed red. That's a lie. He's twisting. Marshall reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and tapped a button. A recording filled the silence. Grace's fragile voice, trembling. Mommy's friend Brian. He cut them off. She burned me with cigarettes. The room erupted with horrified whispers. Someone dropped a drink. Candace's knees buckled. Marshall, stop, please. But Marshall wasn't finished. He turned his gaze on Brian. Tell them how you laughed when she cried. How you called her accidents funny. Brian smirked, though his eyes darted nervously. Kid wet the bed. What was I supposed to do? Treat her like a princess? Come on. She was pathetic. Marshall had him now. The recording device caught every word. Gasps filled the room again, sharper this time. Even Brian's friends edged away from him. Marshall stepped closer, towering over him. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. You laid your hands on my child. You mutilated her. You scarred her for life. And you laughed. Brian swallowed hard, trying to hold his ground. What are you going to do, Ranger boy? Beat me up in front of all these people? Marshall leaned in, his face inches from Brian's. No, I'm going to destroy you. Piece by piece. You're finished in this town. Your job, your reputation, your freedom gone. You won't be able to buy a cup of coffee without someone spitting in it. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. Every one of you here is a witness. You heard the confession. You saw the truth. You know what they did to Grace. All eyes shifted to Candace, who was trembling, her mascara streaking down her face. Marshall, please, she whispered, reaching a hand toward him. He recoiled like her touch was poison. Don't you dare speak my name. You lost that right the second you stood by and let him hurt our daughter. Candace's lip quivered. I didn't. You watched, Marshall roared, his voice cracking the air like a whip. You watched him do it. You let him. That makes you just as guilty. The room was dead quiet again. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Marshall turned back to Brian, his eyes like cold steel. You have two choices, Brian. You disappear, leave this town, leave this state, never come within 100 miles of my daughter again. Or, he leaned in close, his words low but carrying across the silent room. Or I bring destruction down on you so complete, you'll wish you'd never been born. Brian sneered, but sweat dripped down his temple. Marshall pulled back, straightened, and looked at the crowd one last time. This isn't over. But tonight, you've all seen what they are. Remember it. He tapped his jacket where the recorder sat, ensuring everyone saw the gesture. The message was clear. The evidence was secure, and the reckoning had only begun. Marshall's voice was flat as granite as he delivered the final words. Exile or destruction. Choose wisely. And with that, he turned and walked out of the stunned, silent house, leaving Candace and Brian to drown in the wreckage of their own betrayal. Chapter 4. War on Paper. The hospital lights were harsh, sterile, almost too clean compared to the filth that had been done to Grace. Marshall sat in the pediatric wing, his daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, her body lying limp on the bed as doctors and nurses moved in and out like a military unit on high alert. Multiple fractures, one doctor muttered, examining x-rays clipped to a light board. Some old, some healing wrong. These didn't happen by accident. Marshall sat rigid in the chair, his jaw locked. He forced himself to listen, to catalog every detail. Another nurse lifted Grace's nightgown, revealing burns dotted across her back. Perfect round marks. Cigarettes. Second-degree burns, consistent with systematic abuse, the nurse said softly, anger hidden under her professional tone. Marshall closed his eyes. He'd seen men tortured in war zones, the handiwork of terrorists and warlords. Never had he imagined his daughter would carry the same scars. He stood abruptly. Write everything down. Every injury, every scar, every mark. I want a full report, photographs, statements. Don't leave out a single detail. The doctor nodded. Mr. Wallace, we'll compile everything. But this isn't just a medical case. You need law enforcement involved immediately. Marshall's voice was steel. They'll be involved. Trust me. 2 hours later, Marshall sat across from Major Ellen Ramirez, a military lawyer who had worked with the Judge Advocate General's Corps for 15 years. Her office was stacked with case files, commendations, and framed photos of soldiers she defended. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "I've read the medical reports, seen the photos. This isn't neglect, it's systematic torture. We're not talking about a custody battle anymore. This is federal-level abuse." Marshall slid the small recorder across her desk. "And that's Brian confessing. Candace trying to deny, but then choking on her guilt. It's all there." Ramirez hit play. Brian's smug voice filled the office. "Kid wet the bed. What was I supposed to do? Treat her like a princess?" She was pathetic. Ramirez's lips pressed into a thin line. That alone could bury him. Combined with the medical evidence, he won't walk away from this. Marshall's gaze was ice. "And Candace? She loses custody permanently. No judge in America will grant her rights after this. We'll file for emergency suspension immediately." That evening, Marshall sat with FBI Special Agent Daniel Heller in a cramped conference room downtown. Heller was mid-40s, sharp suit, thinning hair, and the kind of weary look men got after years of chasing human monsters. "You're telling me," Heller said slowly, tapping the case file, "that your wife's boyfriend crossed state lines with your daughter during some of these incidents? Took her to his brother's property in Georgia?" Marshall nodded once. "Grace told me through sobs, and I traced gas charges on Candace's joint account. Weekends they said they were at her mother's. They were across state lines." Heller leaned back. "That's it then. Federal jurisdiction. He's not just facing local charges. We're talking kidnapping enhancements, aggravated child abuse, conspiracy. 8 to 12 years minimum, probably more." Marshall's jaw clenched. It wasn't enough. No sentence could undo what they'd done. But it was a start. "Make it stick," he said flatly. "Oh, it'll stick," Heller replied. "We'll wrap this case so tight they won't even dream of parole hearings." 2 days later, Marshall stood in family court. Candace sat across the aisle, makeup caked on, hands shaking as she clutched a tissue. Brian wasn't present. He was already in a holding cell, arrested at his office in front of stunned coworkers. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, flipped through the files in front of her. She had the photos, the medical reports, the recordings. "Mrs. Wallace," the judge said, her tone razor sharp, "you were present while this abuse occurred?" Candace's lips quivered. I didn't stop it, but answer the question," the judge snapped. Candace broke down. "Yes, I was there," the courtroom murmured. Marshall didn't move. He sat with his hands folded, eyes forward, rage pressed deep into his chest. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Wallace, you are hereby granted full legal and physical custody of your daughter, Grace Wallace. Effective immediately, Candace Wallace is stripped of all parental rights. No visitation, no contact. This court finds her complicit in the systematic abuse of her child." Candace sobbed, reaching out as though Marshall might soften. "Marshall, please." He didn't look at her. He only rose, collected the paperwork, and nodded once. The judge's gavel cracked. Court adjourned. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones and cameras shoved in Marshall's direction. "Mr. Wallace, how does it feel to know your wife and her lover were abusing your daughter while you were deployed?" Marshall's eyes flashed. He stopped, stared into the nearest camera, and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "It feels like war. And I promise you this. Nobody hurts my daughter and walks away from it." He turned, shielded Grace, who was clinging to Alex Sims's hand, and pushed through the crowd. Later that evening, Marshall sat at his kitchen table with Agent Heller and Major Ramirez. The case files were stacked high, evidence cataloged and sealed. "Brian's arraignment is in 2 days," Heller said, flipping a page. "We've got him on child abuse, kidnapping, and crossing state lines for the purpose of committing a felony. He's looking at federal time." Ramirez added, "Candace? She's finished. No rights, no leverage. We'll pursue charges of endangerment and complicity, but her punishment starts with losing her daughter forever." Marshall's face was stone. He reached across the table, pulled the custody documents toward him, and signed his name with deliberate care. When he set the pen down, he exhaled slowly. The soldier in him had fought wars with rifles and squads. This war was fought with paper, law, and precision. And just like on the battlefield, victory meant crushing the enemy completely. Hours later, Marshall stood over Grace's bed as she slept. Her small hand, bandaged and fragile, rested on her stuffed rabbit. She stirred slightly, then settled again. Marshall brushed her hair back gently. "It's over now, baby girl. They can't touch you anymore." But his voice carried no softness when he added in a whisper only the shadows could hear. "And if they try, they'll find out what war really is." Chapter 5, Custody and Fortress. The ink on the custody papers was barely dry when Marshall walked out of the courthouse with Grace in his arms. She clung to him with the quiet desperation of a child who had learned too early that love could vanish without warning. Alex Sims trailed behind them, watching the reporters who swarmed outside, but kept their distance under Marshall's cold stare. The flash of cameras lit the steps, but Marshall didn't break stride. Every step away from that courthouse was a step into a new war, not fought in deserts or jungles, but on the home front. That night, as Grace slept curled against his chest, Marshall opened his laptop and began mapping out a plan. It wasn't enough to win custody. He had to build a fortress, a home so secure no threat could ever reach her again. 2 weeks later, Marshall closed on a modest house tucked deep in the North Carolina hills. A white farmhouse with peeling paint, a wide porch, and enough land around it to make approaching unseen impossible. To most, it looked quiet, almost forgotten. To Marshall, it was perfect. Grace toddled through the empty rooms, her bare feet padding on hardwood floors. She stopped in what would become her bedroom, gazing at the wide window. "Daddy," she whispered, "no bad people can come here, right?" Marshall crouched down beside her. "Not here, baby girl. Not ever again. This house is ours, and I'll make it stronger than Fort Bragg itself." She giggled faintly at the joke, though her eyes still carried shadows. Within days, the property became a construction zone. Marshall called in favors from old Army buddies, men who owed him their lives, men who trusted him without question. First came Hank Bulldog Mercer, a wiry former combat engineer who unloaded crates of reinforced locks, ballistic film for windows, and steel bars disguised as decorative shutters. "Perimeter first," Hank said, sketching diagrams on the porch railing. "Motion sensors, cameras, reinforced doors. We'll make it so a mouse couldn't cross the lawn without you knowing." Then came Luis Ortega, a communications specialist, lugging cases of equipment. "I'm setting up a private server," he said, stringing cables with military precision. "Encrypted feeds, 24/7 monitoring. You'll see every angle of this place from your phone. Hell, I'll put a drone in the air if you want." Finally, Jack O'Neill, an ex-sniper with a quiet demeanor, arrived with a truckload of fencing and tactical gear. "I'll help with Overwatch," he said simply. "Teach you sightlines, fallback positions. If trouble comes, you'll have choke points ready." By the end of the month, the farmhouse had transformed. The white picket charm remained on the surface, but underneath, it was a fortress. Hidden cameras in birdhouses, reinforced doors disguised as antique wood, and a panic room disguised as a basement storage closet. Marshall stood in the yard one evening, arms crossed, watching the final camera feed light up on his tablet. He nodded in satisfaction. "This isn't just a house," he murmured. "This is a stronghold." Grace, meanwhile, faced her own battle. At the children's hospital, Marshall sat beside her as doctors fitted her with a lightweight prosthetic for her missing fingers. Grace stared at it nervously, her bottom lip trembling. "It looks funny," she whispered. Marshall squeezed her shoulder gently. "It looks strong, like a hero's hand. You know what I see when I look at it?" She peeked up at him, eyes wide. "What?" "I see courage. I see my little girl who's tougher than anyone I've ever met. Stronger than Daddy. Stronger than all the Rangers I served with." A shy smile crept across her face. She lifted the prosthetic hand and flexed the fingers. The joints clicked softly, the metal gleaming in the hospital light. "Like Iron Man?" she asked. Marshall chuckled, brushing a tear from his eye before she could see. "Exactly like Iron Man. Therapy was harder. Grace sat cross-legged in a circle of toys at the Child Trauma Center. Her therapist, Dr. Elaine Porter, knelt nearby, her voice calm, inviting. "Grace, do you want to tell me about the nightmares?" Grace shook her head, eyes darting toward Marshall sitting just outside the circle. Dr. Porter smiled gently. "It's okay. You don't have to use words. You can draw." She slid a box of crayons across the floor. Grace hesitated, then picked a black crayon. Slowly, shakily, she drew a stick figure holding something sharp. Another figure, smaller, with red lines on the hand. Marshall's chest ached. He wanted to scoop her up, to erase every memory, but he forced himself to sit still. This was part of the healing. His battlefield instincts had no place here. Later, in Dr. Porter's office, she leveled with him. Grace is resilient, but she needs consistency, a safe environment, and she needs you not just as her protector, but as her father. Marshall nodded. "I can be both." Dr. Porter studied him for a long moment. "Then she has a chance." At night, when the house was quiet, Marshall often stood watch at the window, scanning the perimeter. The cameras fed to his phone, green lights blinking in the dark. He no longer wore his combat uniform, but every movement, every breath carried the discipline of a soldier on patrol. Behind him, Grace would stir and whisper, "Daddy." He'd turn, smile, and crawl into bed beside her. "Go back to sleep, baby girl. I'm right here." And she would, slowly, hesitantly, but with growing trust. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Alex Sims visited. He leaned on the porch rail, sipping a beer, watching Grace chase fireflies in the yard with her new prosthetic glinting in the fading light. "You've turned this place into Fort Knox," Alex muttered with a half-smile. Marshall shrugged. "It's what she needs." Alex studied him. "And what about what you need?" Marshall didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on Grace, her laughter ringing across the yard, fragile but real. Finally, he said, "What I need is simple. For her to laugh again. For her to sleep without fear. For her to grow up knowing she's safe. Everything else is noise." Alex nodded slowly. "Then you found your new mission." Marshall's gaze hardened. "Not a mission, Alex. A war. I'm done being just a soldier. Now I'm something else. A father warrior." The words settled into the evening air, heavier than the fading light. Grace twirled in the grass, her laughter carrying like a promise of what could still be rebuilt. Marshall's grip tightened on the porch railing. His house was fortified, his allies loyal, his daughter healing inch by inch. The battlefields of his past had forged him into a soldier. But here, in this house, with Grace's fragile trust in his hands, Marshall became something stronger, something permanent. Chapter 6, Ghost Return. The years passed, but Marshall Wallace never allowed himself to grow complacent. His farmhouse stronghold became more than just a home. It became a bastion of safety where Grace learned to live again. By the time she reached 12, she could laugh without flinching, sleep without night terrors, and run across the yard with her prosthetic hand flashing like a badge of courage. But Marshall knew peace was fragile. He had spent too many years in combat zones to believe safety was permanent. War always found its way back. And one gray October morning, it did. Brian Lowell was released from prison 5 years earlier than scheduled. The news reached Marshall in the form of a single text from Hank Mercer, his old engineer buddy who still had contacts in federal systems. "Hank, he's out. Early release. Good behavior. Watch your 6. Marshall read the words in silence, his jaw tightening. He stood at the kitchen window, watching Grace rake leaves into a pile beneath the oak tree. She was humming, carefree. He wouldn't let her innocence be stolen again. He thumbed a reply. "Marshall, already ready." 2 weeks later, the second shadow reappeared. Candace. Marshall caught sight of her first through his surveillance feed. The grainy footage showed her standing outside the county courthouse beside Brian, their heads bent close, whispering like conspirators. Brian had aged poorly, his once cocky posture now sagging, his eyes sunken, but Candace carried herself with the brittle confidence of someone clinging to old illusions. That night, in a motel room off Route 12, their voices were caught by a bug Marshall's team had planted weeks earlier. Candace's voice hissed through the speakers in Marshall's office, laced with venom. He stole everything from us. Grace should have been mine. My daughter. He poisoned her against me. Brian chuckled darkly. The courts eat up stories about unstable vets. All we need are the right documents. Psychological evaluations. Fake records. I know a guy who can make them look clean. We'll paint him like a ticking time bomb. And once the judge believes it, Candace added, her voice trembling with twisted anticipation, we get Grace back. We show her who her real family is. Marshall sat in the glow of the monitor, his hands folded calmly. The fury that rose inside him was cold, disciplined. They thought they were planning a clever ambush. They didn't know he had been waiting for this day. Every system in his home calibrated for it. The following month, the first legal documents arrived. A notice appeared in Marshall's mailbox. Petition for custody review. Allegations of emotional instability, violent tendencies, and inability to provide a safe environment for a child. Alex Sims was sitting on the porch when Marshall handed him the envelope. The old Marine squinted, then barked a bitter laugh. They're really going to try that unstable veteran card? Hell, you're the most squared-away man I've ever met. Marshall's expression didn't change. They think paperwork can undo what the courts already decided. They underestimate how long I've been preparing. He tapped the folder on the table. Inside, meticulously cataloged, was everything he'd collected. Video recordings, audio files, forged emails Candace had already sent to Grace over the years, and even surveillance clips of Brian visiting shady contacts for the fake documents. Grace, now older and wiser, overheard the conversation. She stepped onto the porch, her prosthetic hand clutching a notebook she had been doodling in. Daddy, are they trying to take me away again? Marshall crouched in front of her, resting his large hands on her shoulders. They'll try, sweetheart. But listen to me carefully, they can't win. Not against the truth. Not against us. Her eyes watered, but she nodded firmly. I trust you. The custody hearing was scheduled for early spring. On the day Brian and Candace made their first official move, they walked into the courthouse with smug expressions, clutching folders thick with forged records. Brian's suit was ill-fitted, Candace's makeup heavy, both wearing the masks of people who believed they had already won. Marshall was already inside, seated with his lawyer and 2 federal agents from the FBI's Child Crimes Division. He wore his dress blues, medals gleaming not as vanity, but as testimony. His posture was calm, his face unreadable. Candace's smirk faltered the moment she spotted him. Brian, though, leaned close to her and muttered, Relax. Once the judge sees our papers, he won't stand chance. But Marshall had anticipated this exact tactic. When their attorney presented the evidence, claiming Marshall suffered from PTSD so severe he was unfit to parent, the judge frowned, glancing between the documents and Marshall's composed demeanor. That's when Marshall's lawyer rose. Your Honor, these documents are forgeries, and we can prove it. The courtroom projector flickered to life. One by one, surveillance videos rolled. Brian meeting with a forger in a parking lot. Candace dictating false claims into her phone. Audio recordings of their motel conversations, with her voice sharp and unmistakable. We'll paint him like a ticking time bomb. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Brian's face drained of color. Candace clutched her seat, shaking her head furiously. This is entrapment. Brian roared, leaping to his feet. No, the FBI agent said coolly from the front row. This is evidence. Months of it. The judge slammed his gavel, ordering silence. Marshall didn't move. His gaze locked on Brian and Candace with the same steady intensity he once held in combat. This wasn't rage. This was the satisfaction of a soldier who had anticipated the enemy's move before they even knew they would make it. That night, back at the farmhouse, Marshall stood on the porch as the crickets sang in the fields. Grace leaned against him, her head on his arm. They tried, Daddy. Yes, they did, he said softly. But they lost. He kissed the crown of her head. They'll always lose. Because we're ready. Because nobody, and I mean nobody, hurts my daughter and gets away with it. The surveillance monitors inside hummed quietly, their feeds recording, their silent watch unbroken. The war had come knocking again, and just as he'd promised, Marshall had been waiting. Chapter 7, The Trap. Marshall had learned long ago that wars weren't always won with bullets. Some were won with patience, foresight, and the quiet laying of snares. This war, the one for his daughter's future, required every ounce of discipline he had. Brian and Candace thought they were clever. They believed a few forged records, some whispered allegations, and a court petition would unravel years of truth. But Marshall had built his defenses with the same precision he once used to secure enemy compounds. Every camera, every recording, every witness statement, all positioned like tripwires waiting to snap. And now the trap was ready to spring. The meeting with the FBI took place in a nondescript federal building 2 towns over. Marshall walked in wearing jeans and a dark jacket, carrying a plain briefcase. Beside him was Alex Sims, his old Marine neighbor, and Hank Mercer, the engineer buddy who had tipped him about Brian's early release. Inside the conference room, Special Agent Selena Harlow sat with a stack of files. She was sharp-eyed, mid-40s, with the kind of presence that made liars crumble. "Mr. Wallace," she said as Marshall placed the briefcase on the table. "You said you had something that ties Lowell and Candace Wallace directly to conspiracy and forgery. I'll be blunt, we need it airtight." Marshall opened the briefcase. One by one, he laid out the evidence like a soldier setting down weapons before battle. Video recordings, he said evenly. Brian meeting with a document forger. Audio files of Candace dictating lies for the court. Surveillance of them coordinating, time-stamped, and authenticated. Cross-checked with my security network and third-party verification. Hank slid a thumb drive across the table. Metadata analysis. Every file's been scrubbed, checked, and mirrored. No chance of a defense attorney crying tampering. Alex leaned back, folding his arms. "In my day, we called this overkill. These days, I call it peace of mind." Agent Harlow scrolled through the files on her laptop. The color drained from her face, replaced by a steeliness Marshall recognized. The look of someone who had just been handed an ironclad case. "This isn't just forgery," she muttered. "This is perjury, conspiracy, and attempted custodial interference. They didn't just try to smear you. They tried to steal your daughter with lies." "Not tried," Marshall corrected coldly. "Plotted, and I don't care how many years pass. They'll never get near Grace again." The sting operation unfolded in less than a week. The FBI arranged a false custody mediation meeting at the county courthouse, baiting Brian and Candace into believing their fabricated documents had gained traction. Unaware of the net closing around them, the two walked in together, holding hands like partners in crime. Candace wore her usual smug smile, whispering to Brian as if she already heard the gavel in her favor. Brian's eyes darted around, suspicious but eager, his arrogance barely contained. Marshall was there too, but not in the courtroom. He sat in a side chamber with Agent Harlow and 2 federal marshals, watching on a live feed as the conspirators stepped straight into the trap. The judge began with a calm tone, asking for preliminary statements. Candace rose, voice syrupy and false. "Your Honor, we simply want what's best for Grace. Her father has a history of violent tendencies. The doors opened sharply. 2 FBI agents strode in, badges raised. "Brian Lowell, Candace Wallace. Stand up. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit perjury, forgery of federal documents, and attempted custodial interference." The courtroom gasped. Candace's face collapsed, her voice rising shrill. "This is ridiculous. We're the victims. He's manipulating everyone." Brian surged to his feet, fists clenching. "You set us up. You think you can ruin me twice." The marshals had him in cuffs before the rage could turn physical. Candace tried to pull away, screaming, but the agents hauled her out with the efficiency of professionals who had dealt with every excuse in the book. From the side chamber, Marshall watched without a flicker of expression. Only when Grace's name was shouted in desperation by Candace, "Grace is my daughter," did his jaw tighten. Agent Harlow glanced at him. Satisfied, Marshall's reply was measured, quiet. "When the judge signs the permanent protection order, then I'll be satisfied." The legal process moved swiftly this time. The mountain of evidence was impossible to deny. The recordings of Candace's voice, the video of Brian meeting the forger, the metadata, the corroborating testimonies. It painted a picture not even the slickest lawyer could distort. Brian was charged with perjury, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping under federal statutes. His parole was revoked, and the judge's tone was merciless. You squandered your second chance. This time, you will serve every day. Candace fared no better. Her attempt to cast herself as a manipulated partner shattered under the weight of recordings where she drove the conspiracy herself. You thought you could erase the truth, the prosecutor said in closing. Instead, you erased your right to ever call yourself a mother. When the gavel fell, both were remanded into federal custody. The sentences were long, far longer than the first time. Marshall sat through the hearing in silence, Grace beside him. She was old enough now to understand more than he wished she could. Her small hand curled into his. When the judge announced the permanent protection order, forbidding Candace and Brian from any contact, forever, Grace exhaled shakily, as if a weight she didn't know she carried had finally lifted. Does this mean they can't find me anymore? She whispered. Marshall leaned down, his voice steady. It means they don't exist in your world anymore. They're gone, Grace. Permanently. Her eyes glistened. She nodded, burying her face in his uniform sleeve. That night, back at the farmhouse fortress, Marshall gathered a small circle, Alex, Hank, and two other veterans who had helped run the security net. They sat around the oak table in the kitchen, coffee mugs steaming. They won't see daylight for a long time, Hank reported, sliding over the official paperwork. And even if they do, the protection order guarantees they can't come within 100 miles of Grace. Any slip, and it's another felony. Alex raised his mug. To the end of ghosts. Marshall didn't toast. Instead, he looked toward the living room, where Grace was curled on the couch sketching in her notebook, her prosthetic hand moving smoothly across the page. She was smiling, truly smiling. He let the moment sink in, his voice finally breaking the silence. This wasn't just about winning. This was about erasing them from her life. They don't get to haunt her. Not anymore. For the first time in years, Marshall felt something close to peace. Not the fleeting kind that came between battles, but the durable kind of father built brick by brick, wall by wall, until nothing could breach it. Grace looked up from the couch and called, Daddy. Yes, sweetheart. She smiled softly. I feel safe. Marshall's throat tightened. He gave a single nod. Good. That's how it's always going to be. And with Brian and Candace locked away, erased from her world forever, Marshall Wallace knew his war for Grace had been worth every ounce of blood, sweat, and steel. Chapter 8. Healing the Wounds. The first year after Brian and Candace's arrest felt like a long exhale, not quiet, not without effort, but steady, cleansing. Marshall had been living two lives for so long. The soldier who carried missions in his blood, and the father forced to fight wars no child should ever face. Now, for the first time, he let one of those lives go. The retirement papers had been signed in the spring, the Army brass offering him a final salute for 22 years of service. No fanfare, no ceremony. Marshall requested it that way. He wasn't leaving in disgrace, nor in triumph, just in completion. He had served, and now his mission had shifted. He and Grace moved to Asheville, a place with mountains that rose like old sentinels and air that smelled of pine and rain. He chose it deliberately, far enough from the past, close enough to nature to feel grounding. The house he purchased was modest, tucked at the end of a long gravel road, but like everything Marshall touched, it became fortified within weeks: cameras, reinforced locks, a perimeter system only he and his veteran friends knew how to operate. But the fortress wasn't just for defense anymore. It was a place where Grace could finally breathe. Daddy, look. Marshall was on the porch, sanding down a chair, when Grace came running across the yard. She wore a sky blue dress, her hair braided to one side, and on her left hand, the new prosthetic glistened in the sunlight. Sleek, custom-made, it flexed with her every movement. She held up the sketchbook in her other hand. The page showed a careful drawing of the mountain ridge behind their house. Lines traced with steadiness, colored with confidence. You did that with a new hand? Marshall asked, standing to take a closer look. Grace nodded proudly. Dr. Patel said it would take me months to get used to this grip. But I practiced. See, she flexed the prosthetic fingers, then twirled the pencil between them. Marshall chuckled low in his throat. Guess she didn't know who she was dealing with. Grace grinned, leaning against him. I get that from you, you know. His arm slipped protectively around her shoulders. No, sweetheart. You get that from yourself. Don't let anyone tell you different. Therapy sessions became their new routine. Twice a week, they drove into town where Grace met with Dr. Hannah Miller, a child trauma specialist who somehow balanced gentleness with unflinching honesty. Marshall always waited outside during the sessions, pacing or drinking black coffee in the lobby. One afternoon, as Grace came out smiling, Dr. Miller stopped Marshall. She's doing better than most kids I've seen in her situation, the therapist said quietly. She's strong, but it's not just her. It's you. She trusts you completely, and that trust is what's helping her rebuild. Marshall nodded, throat tight. That's the only mission I have now. Dr. Miller studied him a moment. Then make sure you also rebuild yourself. Soldiers sometimes forget they need healing too. He didn't answer, but the words followed him home. Evenings in Asheville looked different than they had anywhere else. No gun oil to clean from his hands, no tactical maps spread across a table. Instead, Marshall cooked simple meals at first, then more elaborate dishes as Grace grew bolder in helping. One night, they burned the chicken so badly smoke filled the kitchen, and Grace laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. This is a disaster, she gasped, waving a dish towel at the smoke alarm. Marshall fanned the air with a pan lid, grinning. Soldiers' rations were worse. You'll survive. Pizza delivery, she suggested. Pizza delivery. They ate cross-legged on the living room floor, greasy boxes between them, the kind of moment so ordinary it felt sacred. Marshall also began writing, not in a journal, but in letters. Some were to Grace, sealed in envelopes for her to open years later. Others were to fallen comrades, words he'd never spoken out loud. Writing forced him to slow down, to look at scars without pretending they weren't there. One night, Grace found him on the porch with a half-finished letter. Is that for me? She asked. Marshall folded the paper gently. Someday, when you're older. She tilted her head. You don't have to wait to tell me things. I'm tougher than you think. He met her eyes, those same clear eyes that had seen too much already. Slowly, he nodded. Yeah, you are. Seasons shifted, each one marking progress in ways neither of them had expected. In the summer, Grace joined an adaptive sports program, learning how to kayak with her prosthetic. Marshall stood on the dock, watching as she paddled with determination, water sparkling around her. In the fall, they hiked the mountain trails, Grace insisting she could keep up. At one steep ridge, she slipped slightly, and Marshall caught her arm. Got you, he said. She pulled free, stubborn but smiling. I know. You always do. By winter, their house was filled with warmth, not just from the fireplace, but from the rhythm of a home finally healing. Grace decorated a Christmas tree with ornaments she made herself, each one a symbol of resilience. Stars, mountains, and even a little paper soldier. When she placed it at the very top, she looked at him. That one's you. Always watching, always protecting. Marshall swallowed hard, pulling her into a hug. The bond between father and daughter grew deeper than either had imagined possible. One spring morning, on the anniversary of their move, Grace surprised him with a small wrapped box. What's this? He asked, puzzled. Open it, she urged. Inside was a keychain, a small metal tag engraved with the words Protector and Dad. Marshall turned it over in his hands, his chest tightening. Where'd you get this? I made it in shop class, she said, beaming. Because that's who you are, not just a soldier. My protector, my dad. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His eyes burned, his throat locked. Then he crouched down, cupping her face with his hands. Grace, I've fought a lot of battles. Some I won, some I lost. But you're the only victory that ever mattered. She hugged him fiercely, and he knew then that no medal, no rank, no uniform could ever match the honor of those words. Asheville gave them space not just to survive, but to live. The mountains stood eternal. The forests whispered quiet strength, and the home they built together became more than a fortress. It became a sanctuary. Marshall still woke sometimes in the night, instincts on edge, the ghost of war tugging at him. But when he looked across the hall and saw Grace sleeping peacefully, her prosthetic resting on the nightstand, the tension eased. He no longer needed to be a soldier. Not here. Not anymore. Grace had healed, was healing still, and so was he. Piece by piece, laughter by laughter, sketch by sketch, they rebuilt each other. On the porch one evening, the sun setting behind the ridges, Grace leaned against him and sighed contentedly. "This feels like home," she whispered. Marshall kissed the top of her head. "That's because it is, sweetheart. And as long as I'm here, it always will be." And in that moment, Marshall Wallace, once a warrior forged in battles overseas, now a father forged in love, found peace not in the uniform he had shed, but in the role he had finally embraced fully. Protector and dad. Chapter 9. The Final End. The phone rang late in the afternoon, cutting sharply through the quiet hum of Marshall Wallace's Asheville home. He was in the workshop, tightening a joint on Grace's prosthetic hand, her laughter echoing softly from the living room as she sketched designs for a new bike. "Marshall Wallace," he said, voice calm but alert, as if expecting bad news. "Sir, this is Special Agent Heller," the voice said on the other end, crisp and professional. "I've got updates on your former adversaries." Marshall set the tool down, sensing the weight in the agent's tone. "Go ahead." Brian Lowell, Heller began, was attacked in prison last night. Witness reports indicate a violent assault. He's dead. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma, likely from another inmate. Marshall didn't flinch outwardly. His hands remained steady, resting on the workbench, but his chest tightened. Years of threats, plotting, and close calls flashed through his mind. Brian's life had been a hazard from the start. Now it was over, violently, as violent as he deserved. "Any link to Candace?" Marshall asked evenly. "None," Heller replied. "She's been trying to leverage media attention, claiming you somehow orchestrated it. Local outlets are pushing it, but it's falling flat. Her claims lack credibility." Marshall exhaled, a slow, controlled breath. "Good. That's the last thing we need, distractions." Meanwhile, Candace had already begun her predictable spiral. She appeared on small news networks, her voice trembling, painted with desperation and bitterness. "They've taken everything from me. Marshall, he orchestrated this. My partner is dead because of him," she screamed into the camera, hands shaking, mascara streaking her face. Marshall, sitting quietly in his office with Grace's latest sketches on the desk beside him, didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on the drawings, colorful, innocent, alive. Alex Sims, sitting nearby, muttered, "She never learns, does she? Even with him gone, she's still blaming you." Marshall's lips pressed into a thin line. Let her scream into empty air. Nobody who matters believes her. The courts, the law, the truth, that's what matters, not her theatrics. "Your daughter sees it too," Alex noted. "Grace knows where the danger is. She's safe." Marshall nodded, his eyes softening as he glanced toward the living room where Grace was arranging her crayons. That's the only thing that ever mattered. Later that evening, news outlets continued to pick at Candace's claims, but the story quickly fell flat. Reports detailed the prison incident, highlighted her false accusations, and noted the lack of any evidence tying Marshall to the death. Social media erupted briefly, but then died down, the narrative already controlled by facts and official statements. Marshall watched silently as Candace's efforts unraveled in real time. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His victory had never been public. It was private, shielded behind every wall, camera, and safeguard he had built for Grace. "She's desperate," Alex commented. "Will she ever stop?" Marshall shook his head. "She's irrelevant. All that matters is Grace." Grace, sensing the tension, wandered into the office, a small sketchbook clutched in her hands. "Daddy," she asked softly. He crouched to her level. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are they gone?" she asked, eyes wide. "The people who hurt me?" Marshall brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "Gone. Permanently." Her lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. "I like that. Can we color now?" Marshall smiled back, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Absolutely. Let's make something beautiful." The next morning, Marshall received official confirmation from the prison. Brian's death was classified as homicide, but investigators ruled it entirely within the prison system. No outside interference. Candace's claims were noted as false. Marshall filed a brief statement with his lawyer and the FBI. My focus remains my daughter's welfare. All else is irrelevant. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Major Ellen Ramirez, smiled. You're handling this the way you should. Zero engagement with nonsense. Let the law take its course. Candace's credibility is gone. She has no legal ground, and the courts have already protected Grace. Good, Marshall said simply. That's how it stays. For Grace, life continued forward without interruption. School, therapy sessions, and recreational programs filled her days. Marshall took her hiking on weekends, kayaking along the French Broad River, and exploring nearby trails. One afternoon, Grace paused mid-hike and held up her prosthetic hand. Daddy, I can climb higher now without worrying about slipping. Marshall crouched to examine her grip. You're strong, Grace. Stronger than most kids, stronger than most adults. She giggled. Like Iron Man? Exactly like Iron Man, he replied, squeezing her shoulder. They continued up the trail, sun filtering through the dense canopy, birdsong filling the air. Marshall felt a rare sense of quiet, a silence not imposed by vigilance, but by security and peace. At night, they'd return to the house. Marshall checked the perimeter, as always, though now the tension was different. It wasn't fear, but habit, a soldier's instinct that lingered long after battles ended. Cameras, sensors, and the walls he'd built were not just protection. They were symbols of triumph. Grace would sit beside him at the kitchen table, drawing or reading aloud, sharing pieces of her world. Daddy, she said one evening, do you ever get tired of protecting me? Marshall paused, pen in hand, looking at her earnest eyes. No, baby girl, I will never tire of it. It's my job, my honor, to make sure you're safe always. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her book. Marshall also began reconnecting with civilian life, simple errands, community activities, and even volunteering at a local youth center for kids with physical disabilities. Grace loved it, seeing her father not just as a protector, but as someone invested in the wider world. One afternoon, as Marshall helped a boy adjust a prosthetic arm, Grace tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, you're my hero, she whispered. He looked down, smiling faintly. No, sweetheart, you're my hero. You remind me every day why I fight, even when it's not with a rifle, even when it's just love. Candace, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. Her attempts to publicly smear Marshall were ignored, dismissed, and legally blocked. Permanent protection orders prevented her from contacting Grace. Every attempt she made to regain relevance ended in failure. Marshall never celebrated. Victory, he had learned long ago, was meaningless without peace at home. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. The only measure of success that mattered was Grace's smile, her laughter, and the light returning to her eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Marshall sat on the porch, Grace beside him, legs swinging over the edge. Daddy, she asked. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think anyone will ever hurt me again? Marshall wrapped an arm around her. Not if I can help it. And I always will. She leaned into him, satisfied. For the first time in years, Marshall allowed himself to truly breathe. The uniform was gone. The missions overseas were memories. The battles against Candace and Brian were behind him. Now, there was only this, the quiet strength of home, the gentle rhythm of healing, and the unwavering bond between father and daughter. Marshall Wallace, once a soldier, once a warrior, had finally completed his greatest mission. And that mission was nothing short of love, protection, and the slow rebuilding of a life that had been shattered years ago. He didn't need to celebrate the end of Brian's life. He didn't need to gloat at Candace's failure. Those were victories only in a narrow sense. His focus remained absolute. Grace's future, her healing, her happiness, that was all that mattered. And as the wind rustled through the pines and the sun sank behind the ridges, Marshall sat silently, holding his daughter close, knowing that for the first time, they were free. Chapter 10. Absolute Victory. The morning sun spilled gold across the ridges behind Asheville, brushing the farmhouse and the protective walls Marshall had built around it. He stood on the porch, coffee steaming in one hand, the other resting on the railing. Grace's laughter drifted up from the yard below, where she was practicing riding her bike, her prosthetic hand gripping the handlebars confidently. Marshall allowed himself a rare, deep breath, feeling the quiet pulse of life around him. It was the kind of calm a soldier rarely experienced, not the brief lull between battles, but a long, deliberate moment of peace earned through struggle, vigilance, and sheer determination. He watched Grace wobble slightly, then steady herself, pedaling faster. His jaw tightened, a reflex he couldn't shed, but his heart swelled. This was the life he had fought for, the one he had clawed back from betrayal and violence. "Careful," he called down, his voice firm but gentle. Grace looked up, flashing a toothy grin. "I've got this, Daddy. I can do it." He nodded. "I know you can." It was a simple exchange, but in it was everything: trust, security, and the restored innocence of a childhood that had been nearly stolen. Inside, the house was quiet, the kind of stillness that allowed reflection. Marshall moved through each room slowly, surveying the fortress he had built for Grace and himself. Reinforced doors, hidden cameras, secure networks, all measures to ensure nothing from the past could penetrate their new life. Yet more than the physical safety, it was the emotional walls he had nurtured, the routine of therapy, laughter, and love that truly safeguarded them. He sank into his favorite chair in the living room, leaning back with his hands clasped. For years, his mind had been a battleground. Memories of deployment, the shock of finding Grace hurt, the betrayal by Candace, and the years-long war to protect his daughter. Each memory was a scar, but one he carried with purpose. Alex Sims, visiting for the afternoon as he often did, settled into the chair across from him. "You look like you finally caught your breath," he observed. "It's been a long haul." Marshall's eyes, steady and unwavering, met Alex's. "Longer than I thought it would be. But we're here. Grace is safe, and she's thriving." "Thriving is an understatement," Alex said with a small smile. "That kid's stronger than most adults I know, and she's got you as her anchor." Marshall chuckled faintly, sipping his coffee. "I've learned it's not just about being strong. It's about being present, watching, listening, protecting, not with guns or combat, but with everything else I have." Alex raised an eyebrow. "You've always been the kind of guy who does everything at full throttle. Glad to see you're channeling it differently now." "I don't have a choice," Marshall admitted quietly. "Some wars don't end when the fighting stops. Some wars are lifelong." Grace ran inside, cheeks flushed, hair tangled, and eyes shining with excitement. She thrust a folded piece of paper into Marshall's hands. "Look," she said breathlessly, "I wrote a story. It's about a hero protecting a princess from all the monsters." Marshall opened the paper, scanning the words and illustrations. The princess looked remarkably like Grace, armored in color and strength, with a towering figure of a man behind her, unmistakably him. He smiled softly. "This is incredible, Grace. You know what I think?" "What?" "You're writing our story." Her eyes widened. "Really?" "Every word," he said. "Every monster, every victory, every battle. It's our story of survival, of never giving up." She hugged him tightly, her prosthetic hand snug against his chest. "I like our story. I like it when the hero wins." He chuckled, voice low. "The hero always wins. That's the point." Later that afternoon, Marshall walked along the ridge behind the house, Grace skipping beside him. He remembered the long nights after deployment, carrying a child who had been hurt, shaking from fear and pain. The memory of her crawling toward him, mutilated and terrified, still sent shivers through his spine. Yet now, the landscape of memory was tempered by victory, healing, and resilience. "You ever scared?" Grace asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. Marshall looked at her, surprised by the question. "Scared of what?" "Of the bad people. The monsters. The ones who hurt you, or me." He stopped walking, crouching to her level. "Yes, I've been scared. But I also know that fear doesn't define us. Courage does. And protecting each other? That's courage, Grace. Every day you choose to live fully. You're practicing it. She nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the weight of his words. I want to be brave like you, Daddy. You already are, he assured her. Every single day. As evening fell, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple, Marshall and Grace returned inside. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, vegetables, and rice, but the aroma carried warmth and security. They ate quietly, occasionally exchanging playful comments, their bond strengthened by shared trials and joys alike. Afterward, they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars emerge. Grace leaned against Marshall's shoulder. "Daddy," she said softly, "will anyone ever hurt me again?" Marshall held her close. "Not if I can help it. And I always will." Her small hand found his, the prosthetic fingers interlacing seamlessly with his own. The weight of her trust was immense, but he carried it willingly, silently promising that no harm would come to her as long as he drew breath. The house was quiet now, save for the soft wind rustling through the trees. Marshall reflected on all they had endured: betrayal, torture, legal battles, surveillance, revenge, and finally peace. Each step had been deliberate, each decision calculated to ensure Grace's safety. And yet, it wasn't vengeance or punishment that ultimately mattered, it was restoration. He thought of Candace and Brian, gone from their lives, irrelevant in every sense but memory. He didn't celebrate their demise. He didn't gloat at their failures or deaths. Those outcomes were secondary to the life he had rebuilt with Grace. He glanced at her sleeping later that night in her bed, prosthetic hand tucked under her chin, breathing steady and peaceful. The smallest of smiles graced his lips. This was victory, absolute. A soldier might fight battles overseas, might earn medals for courage and skill, but Marshall realized that the fiercest battles, those fought for love, family, and protection, were invisible to the world. No one applauded them. No one celebrated them publicly. Yet they were victories nonetheless. He lowered himself onto the edge of her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You're safe," he whispered. "Always. And I'll make sure it stays that way." The words weren't just a promise. They were a creed he had lived by for years, honed through fire, pain, and unwavering resolve. As he sat back in the chair by her bedside, he thought again of all the darkness they had survived, of betrayal, of cruelty, of the near loss of the one thing he had sworn to protect. And he knew, beyond any doubt, that every obstacle, every enemy, every challenge had led them to this. A moment of clarity, safety, and life reclaimed. He turned toward the window, watching the mountains stand eternal, silent witnesses to their journey. For all the wars he had fought, literal, legal, and emotional, this one had the most profound meaning. Because this time, the victory was complete. Because this time, the person he had sworn to protect was smiling, thriving, and building a life untouched by those who had tried to destroy it. And Marshall Wallace, soldier, father, protector, and warrior, leaned back, the weight of years finally lifting slightly from his shoulders. He knew that the war for Grace's safety would never truly end. Threats could always emerge. Life was never perfectly secure. But he also knew the unshakable truth, one forged in years of fire and devotion. Nobody hurts my daughter and lives to tell about it.